Hi, it's Mr. Johnson. I wanted to check in with you and sort of set the stage for at least the next several weeks. I don't plan on doing this too often, but I think I'm going to occasionally try to give you some notes here or there. That way, it's not all just reading. And we'll kind of see how it goes. We'll play it by ear. But for now, I thought I'd try a little bit of short information given directly to you using this video recording ability and kind of see how it goes. Hopefully everything's been going great for you since I saw you last, but I guess we'll get going here. If you could take a little bit of time, go get some notes or a place to write some things down or open up another tab in your Chromebook. That way you can type down some information because I will be asking you questions about this at some point. You will be needing to apply your knowledge, and I will be doing some concept checks over this information. So writing things down, for lack of a better way of putting it, take some notes on this, and it'll be helpful in the long run. So let's get started. Actually, if you need to pause for just a minute while you open those things up, that's totally fine. You can pause that now. Okay. All right, so here we go. Just to remind you where we were at. We have been talking before we had this whole big long time off. We have been talking a little bit about ecology. Now, ecology has to do with studying relationships between organisms and organisms with their larger environment. So in your notes somewhere, you should already have the difference between these different levels, but let's just review them. First, we have an organism. An organism is one living thing. So it could be a single bull elk like you see on the bottom left of that screen right here. Or it could be one maple tree out in your front yard. Or it could be that one bunny rabbit. So that's one living thing. Each one of those are organisms. From there, we have what's called a population. Now, I'll remind you, this is what we were trying to estimate using those different methods, whether it's the index method, where we're just looking for signs of how many there are, or if we're actually directly counting them, physically counting each individual like they're trying to do on the US Census that's being sent out to the families now. In fact, I just got mine. I need to fill mine out still. But I'll remind you that a population is the same species, the same location, at the same time. So the number of humans in my room right now is 1. It's a very small population. But the number of, maple trees in your neighborhood right now might be quite a lot, depending on what kind of neighborhood you're in. Again, species, location, and time matter. I'll remind you the other 2 ways that we tried to estimate populations would be with a grid, where we figure out the number of individuals in an area, and then we just multiply by the entire area. We call that the quadrat or the transect method. Another way that we did it is the mark and recapture, where you captured a number of beings, or could be butterflies or whatever it might be. You put a mark on them, let them go, and at the end of the day, a percentage of those organisms out there are marked. So you can do some simple math. If you do a recapture, you can do some simple math to figure out the population size. Okay, so here's where we get a little bit more complicated. I'll also remind you that a community is all of the populations in an area at the same time. It's none of them non-living things, so it's only the life forms. An ecosystem would be all of the living and the non-living things together, and they're all interacting. So if a community is all of the trees and birds and squirrels and mice and rabbits and everything in an area, well, then the ecosystem pulls in the air and the air temperature and any water that's there, the nutrients in the soil, those non-living parts. And last but not least, we have the biosphere. The biosphere is everywhere on Earth that life can be found. Now, yesterday I sent you out on an adventure. Hopefully you took me up on that assignment. The assignment was going to be trying to find how much diversity there is in an area. So in order to understand what might be living in an area, we need to understand 3 characteristics of every living thing and every population. One is population density. population density, anytime we talk about density, we say it's a number of things in one area. So you can talk about the density of a marble compared to the density of a metal ball, right? The density of the metal ball is going to be more. It's going to be a higher density than the density of marble. So it's how many things are packed in an area. So a population density is a number of organisms in one area. It could be the number of trees in an acre. It could be the number of rabbits per square mile. It's the number of organisms in one particular area that you decide. Now, the population density is affected by resources and by behavior. So we would expect the density to be a lot higher in places where the resources are more. So rabbits we're probably not going to find in places where we're not going to find as many rabbits in a location where they don't have the food that they need. Or if there is not a lot of water in a location, we're probably not going to find a lot of plants that need a lot of water like a cattail might. And then behavior also. So maybe deer might change their behavior from summer to winter months to avoid being eaten by predators. The population density, again, how packed together they are is in a given area is the density. Population range. This is how far and how widespread an organism or species can be found. So if we talk about the range of one particular bird, well, it might be, a couple hundred miles. Or for that matter, the population of a goose in South Dakota might be, well, living on the bike trail. That might be all the further it decides to go. But if we talk about the population or the range of an organism, or of its species rather, then it's a lot bigger. It's usually determined by living and non-living factors. So, for example, that a duck is going to have to migrate south for the winter to find open water to feed, and so that is determined by the biotic factors of its food, right? The pond weed that it's trying to eat at the bottom of the pond being blocked off by the non-living parts of the environment, that frozen lake. So it could be things like temperature, precipitation, sunlight, predators, parasites, competitors. All sorts of different things can affect how far these living things have to go to, well, stay alive. Here's an example of a range map of the Canada goose. So if you look close here, you can see that there are certain permanent residents. And if you line that up with where Sioux Falls is, well, we have several permanent residents. If you've ever gone along the bike trails or been downtown ever, you've probably seen a lot of geese. Canada geese are those ones that are black with some gray and kind of some patterning on its face, long neck. It's what you think of when you think of a goose. But you can see that there's the kind of a non-breeding areas, there's breeding areas, there's even migratory paths. So a lot of these different range maps will show you where you might be able to find something. A simple way of thinking about it is a palm tree. Why don't we have palm trees that just grow in South Dakota? Well, it doesn't. There's not the right rainfall. There's not the right temperature, mainly, it's for it to survive. All right, and the last of the three characteristics that organisms and population show is population distribution. So this is how spaced out are they. If we look, we can see that the three that we have, the three different types of distribution we have, how they're actually spaced, is clumped, we have random, and we have nearly uniform. Okay, so clumped. What type of organisms would we find clumped? We might find, some examples might be bison in a herd, fish in a school, a bird in a flock. These are grouping animals. These are animals that group together. But some plants show it too, so it's not just animals. Random distribution, this is a little bit, one example, the white-tailed deer is a little bit seasonal, or at least it can be for some organisms, but the white-tailed deer, they just kind of, they'll wander, they'll be in along the rivers, or they will be out in fields, they'll be in the woodlands. One was even in front of my mom's house eating her bird seed on the ground, and she is by Shields. She lives by Shields. So there's a deer that found its way all the way over there. They're just kind of randomly distributed, trying to find that food. They're kind of wandering and grazing. I know they'll be in kind of smaller groups sometimes, and that's usually during mating season or for protection, but again, mainly random. And then nearly uniform, or a couple examples would be things like black bears and penguins and certain territorial birds. So let's get into why we might have the different distributions. One distribution that we might have is clumped. So I took this picture in Glacier National Park, a beautiful place that I suggest going, and be aware of the surroundings. There's a lot of wildlife there. But these are bighorn sheep, and they were up at the pass where you went from one side of the mountain range to the other, and they were just kind of hanging out in a group. Well, why might they be doing that? If you guessed, it had something to do with defense, you're right. So there's a strength in numbers. These bighorn sheep, they don't always have to be the only one on a lookout. If one of the bighorn sheep raises an alarm and takes off running, well, the others don't have to look too far to know where to run. They just follow the white butt of the other bighorn sheep that are taking off and running away. Now, to combat that, certain animals hunt in cooperative groups. So like you may have heard that wolves will hunt in a pack. Well, it's because they have a better chance of catching a bighorn sheep if they work together to pick off some of those sheep. And so usually the clumped has to do with trying to survive either by getting food, finding food, or staying safe and staying away. This is going to be the most common. So most living things are clumped. Random. This is another picture in Glacier National Park, pretty close to where I just took that last picture. These are bear's ears, or it's bear grass, excuse me. It's called bear grass. These flowers stand pretty tall, but if you look at it, they're a few feet tall. But if you look at it, they're really widely spread kind of all over this mountainside. And there's really no rhyme or reason as to how they got there. They just sort of are carried there on the fur of animals and blown in the wind, and they just kind of randomly spread themselves out. Now, this is not as common. In fact, this is one of the least common distribution patterns. A lot of times it has to do with plants that are distributed through the air. The air just kind of picks up seeds a lot of times and carries them around, and that's a really easy example of random. And then uniform. I obviously didn't take this picture. This is not Glacier National Park. These are penguins, and I just shamelessly Google searched that image. But the uniform distribution, this is usually because of negative interactions. Interestingly enough, those penguins, what they'll do is they'll get just close enough to each other that they can stay safe. That kind of almost clumped idea. But they don't want to be so close that one penguin is in another penguin's space. And so they'll start to peck each other if they get too close. And so if I was a penguin, I would want to be as close to all of the other penguins as I can, but I wouldn't want them too close to me or the other way around, and we'd probably start fighting. So it kind of spreads itself out. Now, a lot of times this is territory. So birds, for example, you'll see them sitting up some places and singing. Sometimes they're looking for a mate, but other times they're claiming their territory. They're saying, this is my place, leave me alone. Bears, also, they need a wide range to find what they need. And if they come in contact with each other, they'll fight. Probably not to the death. One will give up and run away and kind of slink off to another territory. But again, it's mainly native interactions. Now, a lot of this revolved around habitat. Habitat has to do with the place that something lives. And so we went back to that rabbit idea, where we're not going to find rabbits in places where they don't really have food. Well, that's because it's not a good place to live if you don't have a lot of food there. So a habitat has to include what an organism needs to survive. There are a few main things. A habitat includes the organism's food, the water, shelter, the space. If I were to ask you to make a habitat for a caterpillar, you might put a stick and some leaves and some water into a big enough jar with a lid with holes in it. Well, you've given them all of that things. You've given it food, water, shelter, space, and you've set it up in a good arrangement. That caterpillar doesn't need to leave the container to go get water. It's in the container with it. For an example to think about is